Here's a rundown of the key points from quiz 3. So on the first question, the first thing we want to remind ourselves of is that what we're talking about here is heroic society. In other words, this is the traditional sort of legendary origin story kind of way that marriages become the bedrock and backbone of the Greek community. And so this is how the marriages that are at the core of society are formed in two different ways in the stories. And in epic poetry like Iliad and Odyssey, other things that are being written at the time when the Dark Age is transitioning into the period of visible Greek history. So the two options here, the two ways in which marriages come together in these heroic stories is patrilocal and matrilocal. Now, the one thing to bear in mind is when you're asked a question like this, what you want to do is talk about what these things are. The names themselves don't tell us anything. And talking about their essential nature also, expresses their contrasts and connects them to the bigger picture. So as you're talking about what they mean, you can use that. You're using that as a basis for what this is telling us about the people that are telling these stories. So patrilocal, a suitor brings back a bride to his own house. And matrilocal, a warrior marries a princess and settles down in her kingdom. Now, obviously, in these stories, the bride doesn't always get a choice of husband because these stories tend to be about the action adventure aspect of what the warrior, the prince, whoever it is doing. But you can see that the matrilocal, the bride stays in her own kingdom, and so she has the support not only of the husband, but also of her own family and her network of friends and community. The husband is the outsider. In the patrilocal version, we have the opposite scenario, that the bride is ripped away from her own home and family and settles down with the husband's community and his extensions. So this might create a political, socio-political connection between the husband's family and the bride's father. But that doesn't help the bride very much because she's disconnected from everybody but her husband and is relating to all the people around her through her husband. So matrilocal is a story that is more likely to result in a beneficial situation for the bride, relatively speaking. Clytemnestra. One of the most striking controversials in ancient literature, and one of the things that I was hoping to get at in terms of the class discussion is that Clytemnestra gets a very dark picture painted of her in Greek literature and in Homer in particular, and the works associated with the Trojan War. Clytemnestra is seen as actively breaking her marriage in order to bring about a better situation for herself. And since what Homer values is the marriage and selflessness as the two key components to a strong and vibrant society, his positive characters are people like, in terms of wives, Penelope and Andromache, both of whom are seen acting in terms of their responsibility to their communities, just as their husbands do. Odysseus at the end, having grown past his original pride, and Hector as being the ideal warrior, acting on behalf of Troy, just as Andromache is his wife. Clytemnestra acts for herself. And so she takes a lover and seeks to create a better situation for herself. In some versions of the story, she is also taking a step beyond this and filling the vacuum that is left by Agamemnon's absence, and becoming essentially a ruling queen with a consort at her side. All very well and good if she were a widow, maybe. But the fact that she has broken her marriage means that she is in for condemnation. Now, the double standard here, obviously, as we all know, Agamemnon is seeking female companionship, and has a great deal of betrayal of his own marriage vows, but doesn't seek to break the marriage, wants to stay married, and so is therefore viewed in a more positive way, even though he's destructive to his bond with Clytemnestra, and in particular, from her point of view, his sacrifice of their daughter, Phegenia, is unforgivable. This parallels Menelaus and Helen. We also talked about Menelaus and Helen, and how Helen gets the short end of the stick in terms of the story. But Menelaus at least is shown as being concerned only with power and has neglected his bride. And so Helen is at least justified in not minding the attentions of Paris, but Helen still seeks to break the marriage bond, and so brings about calamity that's really Menelaus's fault. Likewise, Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. And so the contrast here, on the one hand, Agamemnon behaves badly, but doesn't seek to break the marriage. Clytemnestra behaves badly, seeks to improve her situation, and is vilified in literature. And the contrast in the other direction, Penelope, who holds on to her marriage despite the excellent excuse of Odysseus being gone for 10 years. Part of this is that the suitors that come to her are not accepting responsibility for Ithaca, are instead seeking only the wealth and power and indulgence and greed that comes from potentially being married to Penelope. Even not being married to her, just being suitors, allows them to lounge about the place and eat all of her food and so forth. It's an interesting question, how it would have been handled in literature if Penelope had been sought by someone who was actually worthy of being a responsible leader of Ithaca at Penelope's side. But as it is, what's most important is the marriage bond as being the backbone of society in Homer, in Hesiod, in the foundations of Greek literature, and anyone who acts against that is taken to task and is punished by the gods. The readings. The main thing I just want to say is that all of these readings are very key in terms of particular paper topics that you might be interested in. So if you are looking at how gender is presented in Homer, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, or in legend and fictional characters in general, but particularly if you're looking at gender in Iliad and Odyssey, you want to look at these two Arthur articles. The Dowden article is a critical article for looking at a subject that was not considered by historians as being important for a long time, which is to say, what can we take away from women who are mythological? Is this a valid representation of gender in the societies that created those myths? And one of the things we've been arguing already is that the way that gods and goddesses are portrayed are in contrast to human behavior. The world of the gods is in contrast to human values and tradition and morals. And the same is true in a different way for women of mythological literature, people like Clytemnestra and so forth. These are women that are presented as object lessons, and their behavior is outsized and in some ways contraindicatory of the way that ordinary people behave or are expected to behave. Because these stories are about reinforcing tradition, reinforcing values, contrasting virtue with destructive behavior, selfish behavior. So we'll see the development of this idea when we look at women in tragedy, these outsized figures that are there to talk about gender in the real world. When we look at figures like Antigone and Medea and the women of the Bacchae and so forth. The bottom line here, though, is that you look at figures in literature, this doesn't tell us what the real world is like. This is people talking about fictional representations of the world for a particular purpose. And you have to look at literature, at mythology, from that perspective whenever you're studying history, whether it's for this class talking about women, gender, or anytime you're looking at history. Literature, mythology is not how people behave. It's how people talk about behavior. The other article, also very controversial in terms of its premise, as I overemphasized in the class discussion, but the key idea here that Ortner is talking about is women are identified with the wild, with nature, because of their capacity to create life. And so, again, if you're writing a paper about the societal differences in gender being tracked to biology, the Ortner article, aside from its problematic assumption that all women are subordinate, which is not true, the theme of the Ortner article is something that you want to explore. The way that women are identified with this aspect of nature that creates life, and that this is seen as contrasting to the culture, to the world of society, to the world within the walls and structures of the community. When Nausicaa meets Odysseus, this is a great story. If you didn't read the Nausicaa story, go back and read it, because it's a great moment that doesn't relate directly to the overall story of the Trojan War and its aftermath. This is a princess encountering a wandering man, and this is telling us a story that gives us some very interesting moments. So she does admire his beauty, amplified by Athena for this reason. She does chastise her handmaidens, and she does tell him to ignore her father and talk to her mother. One of the most fun aspects of this is that she makes it very clear her father, the king, is useless. It's her mother, Arte, who is actually the wise and intelligent guide to this community. What she doesn't do is walk boldly into town with him, because she's conscious of her responsibility, and her responsibility includes a palpable sense of chastity before marriage, because as a princess, she doesn't belong solely to herself. Her responsibility is to help create a future through a legitimate marriage that brings honor to both sides. To a certain extent, this would be true if she were a prince. The same thing would apply, but because she is the one who actually bears a child, she is the one who creates the future, the responsibility is greater on the daughter to ensure her own irreproachable character so that when marriage occurs, it is not contaminated by previous associations that were less than above board. And what Nausicaa is showing here in this story is her conscious responsibility, her sense of responsibility to her community, which will make her a good princess and a good queen, like her mother Arte, like Penelope, showing wisdom and determination and selflessness for her community. This is the characteristic depiction of women in ancient Greek literature. How does gender play into Agamemnon and Achilles? So this reading, Agamemnon's insult, the key idea here is that Agamemnon and Achilles are arguing over a spoil of war, which happens to be a woman named Briseis. And so this is showing Agamemnon in particular seeing her only as a trophy and not as a person or a woman. And the thrust of this is not all men are horrible. The thrust of this is that Agamemnon is horrible. Homer is attacking Agamemnon's character because his greed allows him to set aside the honor that he should be showing toward a female prisoner. And part of this is connected to the larger theme in Homer that the Mycenaean Greeks were morally decayed and selfish, greedy, ambitious. Agamemnon is the ultimate expression of this, and this is why the Mycenaean Greek society collapsed. Now the Greeks know better. Now the Greeks know the value of placing the community out of yourself. And in a sense, the Iliad is all about that particular theme. The Greeks are the bad guys because these Greeks, the Mycenaean Greeks, are full of pride and stubbornness and selfishness and greed and ambition. And the result of this is tragedy over and over again. And so this vignette with Briseis and the death of Patroclus and all of this is showing this. And out of the men, only Odysseus is redeemed through another 10 years of trials and suffering that improves his character, so that when he returns to Ithaca, he stands side by side with Penelope, and they become the king and queen that Ithaca deserves, the protectors of their culture and society. And that's the end of the quiz. Please email me with any questions.